Dear comrades and friends, first of all, I'm sending greetings from the Sozialistische Gleichheitspartei and the ICFI in Germany to this important school. The political genocide that Comrade Fred dealt with in his lecture also targeted the Communist International. In my lecture, I will focus on the terror on the Comintern, which was initially built as a revolutionary world party. Already in 1923, it had more than 50 sections, as indicated in this impressive internal list. In that year, the Comintern set all hopes on a revolution in Germany, which had the largest communist party outside of Russia. This photo shows the presidium of the first Congress of the Comintern in 1919. In the middle, there's Lenin. Next to him, on the left, there are Gustav Klinger, a Russian Bolshevik and leader of the autonomous Socialist Soviet Republic of the Volga Germans in 1918. And there's Hugo Eberlein, a founding member of the German Communist Party. Sitting on Lenin's right, there's Fritz Platten, a long-time communist and founding member of the party in Switzerland. He organized Lenin's return to Russia in 1917 and saved his life in 1918, when Lenin's car was attacked in Petrograd. Less than 20 years after this picture was taken, all three of them were persecuted during the Great Terror. The Comintern, as a revolutionary world organization, was being destroyed. Supporters of the left opposition in various national sections had already been expelled and intimidated. By the 1930s, the Comintern had been transformed into an instrument of Soviet diplomatic policy. According to the nationalist program of the Stalinist bureaucracy, summed up in the theory of so-called socialism in one country, it was no longer the task of the International to prepare and coordinate revolutions in other countries. Its role was reduced to preventing an imperialist intervention against the USSR and following the line of the Kremlin under Stalin's dictate. One defeat after another isolated and weakened the Soviet Union. Hitler's rise to power in 1933 marked the catastrophic culmination of the disastrous policies of the Comintern. Thousands from all over the world immigrated to the Soviet Union. Workers, students, professionals, party members, or just enthusiasts and supporters of the first worker state. Many of them sought refuge in the USSR because they were threatened with political persecution at home, especially the Germans after 1933. As a result of the betrayals of the two German workers' parties, the German Communist Party, the KPD, and the Social Democratic Party, the SPD, Hitler came to power and set out to destroy the socialist movement in Germany and Europe. Hundreds of communists, social democrats, as well as Jewish workers and intellectuals had to flee from the Nazis. They now belonged to the so-called Palite Migrante, the political immigrants. But the country of refuge turned out to be a trap. In the Great Terror, a large number of these political immigrants and foreign communists in the USSR were arrested, accused of being foreign spies, and shot or exiled. It is hardly possible to grasp the scale of the bloodbath by merely looking at statistics. And up until today, there are no exact numbers of victims for the different sections of the Comintern. But I want to give you a few facts in the beginning. The largest and most influential group of political immigrants were the approximately 4,600 Germans. During the terror, around 3,000 of them disappeared. By April 1938, 70% of German communists living in the USSR had already been imprisoned. Around 600 Austrians fell victim to Stalin, among them workers, as well as members of the Communist Party and the so-called Schutzbund, the paramilitary arm of the Social Democrats, who had fled Austria after the failed uprisings against the pro-fascist government in February 1934. The Polish party was dissolved, and almost its entire leadership was killed. 25 out of 26 leading Comintern cadres from Poland died in the Soviet Union. 800 Yugoslav communists were murdered. including all the 8 leading Comintern cadres in the Soviet Union and many supporters of the left opposition. The majority of the political immigrants from Hungary were persecuted. 10 of 16 members of the First Central Committee of the Hungarian Communist Party were killed. 600 Bulgarian communists perished in the Stalinist terror. A high percentage of members from the Baltic countries were arrested. 7 out of 8 Latvian and 5 out of 6 Estonian leading Comintern cadres were persecuted. 40 political refugees from Greece were arrested, among them former party leaders as well as former Trotskyists. 27 were sentenced to death. More than 100 Italian communists were arrested, most of them shot. And many Chinese, Korean and Japanese communists fell victim to the repression. And this is not a full list, of course. Several communist parties in Europe were illegal at that time and operated entirely or partially underground, including in Germany, in Austria, Hungary, Bulgaria, Yugoslavia, Italy and Greece. Their members were accused of espionage and suffered the greatest losses. Beginning with its leader Grigory Zinoviev as the prime target in the first show trial, the Comintern staff was reduced by about 50% in the following years of terror. One historian has analyzed the fate of the 375 leading Comintern cadres who were in the Soviet Union from 1936 onwards and could therefore be potential victims of persecution. And more than 40% of them were arrested. Now, before I will give some examples to illustrate the scale of the purges in the second part of my lecture, I want to turn to the causes and aims behind these horrendous crimes. How was it possible that a whole generation of Comintern members was killed? Many bourgeois historians have struggled to answer this question. Some claim that the terror was the logical outcome of the totalitarian nature of the Comintern itself, or the result of paranoia, arbitrary violence, and the bloodthirst of the dictator Stalin. As the Trotskyist movement has insisted, and some serious historians have underscored in their research, the key to understanding the terror within the Comintern is the fear of the Stalinist regime that a revolutionary opposition could challenge its power. In February 1937, Stalin expressed his deep contempt for the Comintern in a conversation with the Bulgarian Comintern leader Georgy Dimitrov. Stalin said, "All you there in the Comintern are playing right into the enemy's hands," unquote. This remark was no slip of the tongue, but an expression of the Stalinist bureaucracy's hostile stance toward this international organization, which, despite having long since ceased to be a revolutionary world party, still embodied internationalism in its structure, composition of its personnel, and above all in the eyes of its supporters around the world. This tradition was a thorn in Stalin's side at a time when he stoked Russian nationalism. The terror within the Comintern was driven by the nationalist reaction of Stalinism to the program of world revolution, the foundation of the Third International. The catastrophic results of the Comintern policies, like the victory of Hitler in 1933, deepened the Soviet Union's isolation and discredited the Comintern among masses of workers and youth around the world. In the face of this crisis, the purges in the Comintern were aimed at reinforcing the position of the Stalinist regime. It feared that the international defeats could provoke criticism within its ranks and strengthen the Trotskyist opposition. As the Russian historian Vadim Rogovin stressed in his book Stalinist Terror of 1937 to 1938, and I quote, "The ferocity of the persecution of the foreign communists was explained to a significant degree by Stalin's fear that socialist revolutions in other lands might arise outside his control. As a result, the center of the revolutionary movement might shift from Moscow, and the movement itself might end up under the leadership of the Fourth International, unquote. Rogovin also pointed to the fact that the immigrants had better access to opposition literature, and some had read Trotsky's books. So the Stalinist regime resorted to mass violence to suppress and preempt any potential opposition and resistance within the communist movement and the broader population. As German historian Hermann Weber explained, quote, "All forces that, because of their revolutionary tradition, could become dangerous to Stalinism, were eliminated in the Bloody Purge. The aim was to destroy cadres who, in some situation, for example crisis or war, could form a counterforce to Stalin's dictatorship. In that sense, the terror was also an indicator of the weakness of the Stalinist system. Power was to be consolidated by brute force," unquote. The arrests initially targeted the left opposition and other former opponents of the regime, but then expanded to large sections of members loyal to Stalin, including many of the political immigrants. With this comprehensive purge, Stalin sought to create a new apparatus loyal to him and uncritical of his interests. Stalin's violence against any real or potential opposition was not a product of mere paranoia, but rooted in the objective contradictions of his regime, as well as the international defeats. While the NKVD arrested Comintern members and political immigrants in Moscow, communist parties in Spain, France and elsewhere formed so-called anti-fascist Popular Front alliances. This simultaneous occurrence of Popular Front politics and terror has been described by some historians as a quote-unquote great paradox. In fact, however, the two developments were intertwined. After the failures of the preceding years, most notably the KPD's policy in Germany that enabled the rise of Hitler, the Stalin regime shifted towards open collaboration with the Western powers, particularly France and Great Britain. According to the Popular Front strategy, adopted at the Seventh World Congress in 1935, communist parties were to enter alliances with bourgeois parties and governments whenever it served the goals of Stalinist foreign policy. During this period, the Comintern was tasked with suppressing revolutionary uprisings in Western European countries in exchange for diplomatic agreements with the governments. Repression served to silence critical voices in order to safeguard the Popular Front. As Comrade David North explains, quote, "The turn by the USSR toward direct collaboration with the international bourgeoisie was complemented by the intensification of state repression within the borders of the degenerated worker state. The inner connection between these parallel processes is generally ignored by bourgeois historians, who find it politically inconvenient to examine why the heyday of Popular Frontism, when Stalinism was being fed in the salons of the intellectual trendsetters, coincided with the wholesale extermination within the USSR of virtually all those who had played a leading role in the October Revolution and the Civil War." And he continues, "The blood purges, which were launched with the opening of the first round of the Moscow trials in August 1936, were intended not only to eradicate all those who might become the focus of revolutionary opposition to the bureaucracy, but also to demonstrate to the world bourgeoisie that the Stalinist regime had broken irrevocably with the heritage of 1917. A river of blood now divided Stalinism from Bolshevism," unquote. The show trials were preceded by an intensified campaign against Trotskyism, launched in the Comintern after the Seventh World Congress. The situation for political immigrants in the USSR had already worsened since the early 1930s, when asylum policies were restricted. In the winter of 1935, that is parallel to the turn towards the Popular Front strategy, the Comintern bureaucracy expanded surveillance of foreign members. political immigrants had to be re-registered, and numerous dismissals and party expulsions followed. The Comintern journal, Communist International, played a significant role in the campaign against Trotskyism on the eve of the terror. In November 1935, representatives from various Comintern sections met in Moscow for an editorial meeting about the danger of Trotskyism, chaired by Palmiro Togliatti, then a leading member of the Italian Communist Party and leading member of the Comintern as well. Unlike the stereotypical anti-Trotskyist propaganda, the Comintern members spoke here relatively honestly about their concern that the Trotskyists and their ideas might gain a foothold within their own ranks, as well as among youth and the working class in general. Togliatti urged that the question of Trotskyism be addressed, quote-unquote, more forcefully than before, given the growth of the communist parties. He examined in more detail the Trotskyist and opposition groups in Western Europe, and he stressed that the small size of their organizations was not decisive. While in the Soviet Union there were special organs that would deal with the Trotskyists, and he obviously refers to the NKVD, this situation was different abroad. And he said, quote, "In capitalist countries, we must argue, we must respond, we must study the Trotskyist arguments, and we must understand in what ways and through what means they can influence newcomers to the workers' movement and the left elements of social democracy, and how we can block their path to these elements and to the workers' movement as a whole," unquote. Togliatti pointed to the problem that some European workers would see Trotskyism as, quote-unquote, just another tendency within the workers' movement. Rank-and-file members would unconsciously, as he put it, repeat Trotsky's arguments. Especially disastrous was the stance towards Stalin. Togliatti said, "Once at a school, I asked what students knew about Stalin. And what did they know? Nothing at all. This is also a task for us." Unquote. In the following discussion, the Austrian delegate agreed that, quote, "we have so far utterly failed to popularize Stalin's significance among Europe's working class," unquote. He said, "The Comintern has had nothing written in opposition to Trotsky's pamphlets, which are stylistically and journalistically brilliantly written." And he then argues, quote, "I believe we must not underestimate the immediate effect that Trotsky's books can have. We cannot respond with mere resolutions and theses," unquote. This was followed by contributions on the Trotskyist influence in other countries, including the Netherlands, Sweden, Romania, Yugoslavia, Bulgaria, Poland, France, Greece, and Czechoslovakia. The Dutch delegate suggested a pamphlet that, quote, "popularized Lenin's struggle against Trotsky because Trotskyism always tries to work with Lenin's name. Lenin and Trotsky, the two leaders of the Russian Revolution," unquote. This pointed to a core problem for the Stalinists. Despite extensive historical falsification since the 1920s, the masses worldwide still associated the October Revolution with Lenin and Trotsky, not Stalin. This editorial meeting illustrates the dilemma faced by Comintern functionaries. On one hand, they needed strong arguments to refute Trotskyists abroad, while they could be persecuted by state organs at home. On the other, Trotskyist arguments were rooted in objective truths, whether Stalin's marginal role and Trotsky's importance in the October Revolution, social inequality in the Soviet Union, or the negative consequences of the popular frontism. The Stalinists responded to this dilemma with slander, falsification, repression, and terror. This river of blood, separating Stalinism from Bolshevism, found expression in the total destruction of the Comintern during the years 1937 and 1938, even though it was formally dissolved in 1943. The German section was a main target of repression. The defeat of the German working class and Hitler's victory were a decisive setback for the world revolution. It confirmed Trotsky, who had warned early on against the fatal social fascism line and fought for a correct policy against the Nazis, the united front of communist and social democratic workers. Stalin's position was clearly weakened, hence the hysteria against anyone who voiced criticism, against all those who were KPD members and had to flee from Hitler. The repression of German communists on charges of Trotskyism were bizarrely linked to accusations that they were fascist agents. In reality, it was Stalin himself who had facilitated the Nazi invasion in 1941 by decapitating the Red Army, sealing the pact with Hitler, and ignoring all warnings of the imminent attack. German historian Hermann Weber compared the fate of leading German cadres until 1945, and he concluded that 256 became victims of Hitler and 208 victims of Stalin. But when we look at the highest level, the German Politburo, more members and candidates were murdered by Stalin than by Hitler. These are the 7 former Politburo members or candidates killed during the Stalinist Terror. There you see Hugo Eberlein. I mentioned him in the beginning as the German delegate at the Comintern Founding Congress, and these are photos before and after his arrest by the NKVD. Then on the left there's Leo Flieg, a founding member of the KPD and a friend of Luxemburg and Liebknecht. He worked for the Comintern in Moscow in the early 1930s, where he lived in the Hotel Lux. In 1938 he was arrested, in March 1939 shot at the age of 45. Then there are also the fervent Stalinists Hermann Remmele and Heinz Neumann, as well as Fritz Schulte, Hermann Schubert and Heinrich Süskind, an Austrian of Jewish origin. And one might add another indirect victim, Ernst Thälmann, the Stalinist KPD leader until his arrest by the Nazis in 1933. He was in Nazi prison for 11 years. Stalin could have saved his life in negotiations with the Germans, but as part of the Hitler-Stalin pact, he decided not to. Thälmann was finally executed on the order of Hitler in 1944. Many German party members were arrested in the Hotel Lux. Once the famous and prestigious living quarter of the Comintern in the heart of Moscow, the Lux turned into a death trap during the Great Terror. The immigrants lived in constant fear, trembling every night if they would be next, if the secret police agents knocked on their door. But the Comintern apparatus was both a perpetrator and a victim of the terror. The Comintern institutions closely collaborated with the secret police and provided detailed information on the biography and political positions of every member. Those functionaries who survived the purges were often directly implicated in the crimes. One example is the German Stalinist Herbert Wehner. You see him on the left. He lived in Hotel Lux during the height of the terror. Under his pseudonym Kurt Funk, he denounced many German emigres and Communist Party members like Leo Flieg and Hugo Eberlein to the NKVD. Wehner sent reports to the Comintern on Trotskyist groups abroad and alleged Trotskyists among German emigres. His reports served as a basis for an order by the NKVD leader Ježov in February 1937. Ježov instructed to immediately examine and arrest German Trotskyists, infiltrate foreign Trotskyist groups and uncover supposed Trotskyists among all German visitors and immigrants to the Soviet Union. Special focus was placed on monitoring convicted German Trotskyists in labor camps. After the war, Wehner, who was thus responsible for the persecution of many political refugees, made a rapid career in the German social democracy. He became a minister in the 1960s and led the SPD faction in parliament until 1983. Until his death, he kept silent about his own role in the Stalinist purges. Other Comintern apparatchiks who survived the terror were also implicated in these crimes. For instance, Georgy Dimitrov, who succeeded Zinoviev as leader of the Comintern during the Popular Front period. He was a fierce opponent of the left opposition for a long time. During the purges, Dimitrov abetted the persecution of the Polish communist leaders by luring them to the Soviet Union, where they were then arrested and executed by the NKVD. The German functionaries Wilhelm Pieck and Walter Ulbricht, who became the leaders of the East German Stalinist regime GDR after the war, both held high positions in the Comintern bureaucracy during the Great Terror and facilitated the liquidation of German communists. In 1937, the Stalinist regime prepared another show trial, this time against the Comintern. Investigators collected material on an alleged anti-Comintern bloc, with veteran functionaries accused of a fictional so-called right-wing Trotskyist conspiracy within the Comintern apparatus. All of the accused, were executed in the following years. This anti-Comintern trial did not take place, but even without it, the purges within the Comintern reached enormous proportions. Yet still, Stalin continually demanded a harsher approach. Trotskyists must be hunted down, shot, destroyed, he declared according to a diary entry by Dimitrov in November 1937. Parallel to the public show trials, the NKVD launched secret mass operations, starting with the so-called Kulak operation in summer 1937. Mass arrests shook the whole country. Many political émigrés were persecuted as part of the so-called national operations of the NKVD against various nationalities and minorities in the Soviet Union, including Germans, Poles, Greeks, Latvians, Estonians, Romanians, and others. The accusation of espionage was combined with additional charges, such as the alleged founding of nationalist insurrectionary organizations. Designated as Greeks, Germans, etc., were not only persons with the corresponding citizenship or ethnic origin, but basically all those whom the NKVD considered to belong to the respective national group or who had some kind of so-called foreign connections. According to estimates, up to 365,000 people were convicted in these national operations, approximately 80% of them sentenced to death. These operations marked the final and brutal break of the Stalinist regime with the Soviet nationalities policy that was established in the time of Lenin. The Declaration of the Rights of the People of Russia was one of the first decrees issued by the Bolsheviks after seizing power. Among other things, the declaration proclaimed equality and sovereignty of the peoples of Russia, the right to self-determination, and the free development of national minorities and ethnographical groups. The declaration's strategic significance was to strengthen internationalism against the old great power chauvinism of the Tsarist regime, to win over the anti-imperialist and national revolutionary movements, and to consolidate the revolution in the periphery and among the previously oppressed minorities. But already in 1922, a fierce dispute arose between Lenin and Stalin on the national question, because Stalin supported Russian chauvinist tendencies. In the years that followed, the Stalinist leadership undermined the nationalities policy and ultimately abolished it. Prior to the mass arrests, it had fueled xenophobia and revived Russian nationalism. Immigrants were accused as spies and used as scapegoats to divert the growing anger about social and economic problems in the USSR. In December 1937, the Politburo decided to eliminate the national territories, as well as the schools and cultural institutions of national minorities, on the grounds that they were under the influence of supposed enemies of the people. The Greek operation was launched in the same month, and I want to shed some light on this example. In December 1937, when it started, Greek schools, theatres, newspapers and publishers shut down, and their staff was persecuted. According to an official report, more than 11,000 people were arrested and 9,450 shot. One researcher even estimates that the figures are twice as high. Almost all of the Greek political emigres who lived in the Soviet Union at that time were subsequently arrested. In Greece, they had been persecuted under anti-communist laws, and most of them escaped from prison before they clandestinely fled on a ship from Greece to the Soviet Union. On this picture on the left, you can see 5 workers in a Greek prison in the early 1930s. And except for one, they all, after they have fled to the Soviet Union, they all perished during the terror. Some were members of the Greek left opposition. And in the USSR, they worked in factories until they were arrested, interrogated about their Trotskyist activities, and executed by the NKVD. One of them was Michalis Bezendakos, a worker in the industrial port city of Piraeus. He joined a Trotskyist organization. Arrested by Greek police in 1931, he faced the death penalty, but was able to escape with the help of the Communist Party in a spectacular prison break in Athens. This is the newspaper of the Greek Communist Party, with the headline on Bezendakos and his prison break. A famous song about his courageous story is still being sung at Greek demonstrations until today. In Moscow, Bezendakos took the pseudonym Georgi Bendas. He married and he worked in an automobile factory. During the purges, he was arrested and executed, leaving behind his wife and 2-year-old daughter. The Stalinist Communist Party of Greece celebrated Bezendakos for a long time as a working-class hero who fought and died as a volunteer in the Spanish Civil War. Rumors about his arrest in the Soviet Union were dismissed as anti-communist lies. Bezendakos' case is symptomatic of the decades-long cover-up by the Greek Stalinists of the persecution of Greek political emigres. The truth was buried for years. These are the documents from his NKVD file. On the right you can see the first interrogation protocol. It must be stressed at this point that these investigations were a pseudo-legal farce without a hint of due process. Interrogations and supposed confessions were falsified and extracted through torture. Bezendakos was then accused of espionage, and the small document you see at the bottom proves his execution. On the 11th of April 1938, he was executed in Butovo. 20 years later, during the 1950s, he was rehabilitated, but his family received a false death certificate, claiming that he actually died of illness in 1942. This was typical. Many families were never informed about the real circumstances of the execution of their loved ones up until the end of the Soviet Union. Certainly, this served to cover up the scale of mass terror. Other Greek victims were convinced Stalinists and former party leaders, cadre students, or journalists working in the regions of the Greek minority. In Greece, in August 1936, after the police suppression of a massive strike movement in Greece, the anti-communist Metaxas dictatorship had come to power, and therefore, when the show trials began, the Greek emigres were not able to return home, just like the German communists. Many actually applied to the Comintern to be sent to Spain as fighters in the international brigades, but most of them were denied and instead arrested. The years of the terror also saw the purge and closure of academic institutions and cadre universities, initially founded after the Civil War to educate foreign and domestic students and lecturers. These included the Communist University of the National Minorities of the West, the CUMS, the Communist University of the Toilers of the East, KUTV, the International Lenin School, and the Institute of Red Professors. They were all closed and dismantled during the terror. In the 1920s, the opposition had significant support in the universities, also among foreign students, for example from China and Yugoslavia. Also during the 1930s, foreign students expressed doubts and criticism about Stalin's policies. You see two examples here on this slide. The young Chinese student Ma Yangsheng got hold of Trotsky's pamphlet criticizing the Sixth World Congress in 1928 and the Stalinist betrayal in China. He built an opposition group at the International Lenin School, which was dissolved in 1930. Approximately 100 Chinese students at another university took part in a Trotskyist group. Ma Yangsheng was arrested and forced into Siberian exile for 25 years. He survived, but back in China, he was again imprisoned as an old Trotskyist by Mao during the Cultural Revolution. On the other side, you see Ante Siliga. He was a founding member of the Communist Party of Yugoslavia, and he worked as a teacher at the Communist University of the West. Together with Yugoslav students, he supported the left opposition in 1929, but he was denounced, sacked from the Cato School, and eventually arrested. After 5 years in prison, an international campaign and a hunger strike, he was able to flee the USSR in 1935, just before the Great Terror started. However, the students, the Yugoslav students, they were in his group, were killed by the secret police, as was the Yugoslav communist and former leader of the Comintern youth, Vojislav Vujović, who had supported the united opposition. A whole layer of scientists, intellectuals, artists, students and workers from around the globe were caught in the wave of mass arrests. I want to give a few more examples. The German Jewish mathematician Fritz Noether fled from the Nazis to the Soviet Union, where he continued his research as a professor at the University of Tomsk. In 1937, Noether was arrested. A letter from Albert Einstein to the foreign minister in his support could save him. Noether was sent to a labor camp and executed in 1941. Another victim was the young German economist Nathan Steinberger you see on this slide. He was invited to study and work at the Institute of Agricultural Science of the Comintern in Moscow, and he emigrated to the Soviet Union with his wife Edith in 1932. As a communist with a Jewish background, he couldn't return to Nazi Germany, and thus he was trapped when the terror began. The NKVD arrested him in April 1937. He spent almost 10 years in a forced labor camp in Siberia. His wife was also arrested in 1941, but the Steinbergers survived, and they returned to East Germany after the war. Despite his experiences in the Gulag, Nathan remained unbroken. He developed great sympathy for the work of the Trotskyists and met with representatives of the World Socialist website for interviews and discussions on several occasions. In an interview in 1997 in Berlin, he stressed, quote, "Precisely because I have remained a socialist, I am a declared opponent of Stalinism. The Soviet Union did not collapse because it was a socialist state, as the anti-communists always claim, but because everything socialist was destroyed by Stalin. He discredited socialism in the foulest way possible and contributed decisively to the crisis of the workers' movement following the end of the Soviet Union." Unquote. Also famous artists, like the German actress Carola Neher, didn't escape the NKVD. Since 1926, Neher worked closely with Bertolt Brecht in Berlin, who wrote several roles of his theatre plays, especially for her. You can see her in one of these plays on the picture. After 1933, she had to flee. She and her husband Anatol Becker, a communist from Bessarabia, immigrated to the Soviet Union, where both of them were arrested and perished in the terror. Bertolt Brecht didn't use his international reputation to rescue her. The German Trotskyist Walter Held sharply criticized Brecht for his silence. In an article in the IKD, the Trotskyist newspaper Unser Wort, Held wrote, quote, "The saddest and most shameful chapter in this bloody tragedy is the attitude of the official German immigration towards the fate of its members who immigrated to the Soviet Union. You, Mr. Brecht, knew Carola Neher. You know that she was neither a terrorist nor a spy, but a brave person and a great artist. Why are you silent?" Unquote. This comment was written in October 1938. A few years later, Walter Held himself ended up in an NKVD prison in Moscow. Held, his real name was Heinz Epe, had fled Germany after the Reichstag fire to Prague and then Oslo. He became a secretary of Trotsky and one of the organizers of his entry into Norway. The Gestapo was searching for Held as a, quote, leading functionary of the Trotsky movement, unquote. After the German invasion of Norway, Held eventually tried to immigrate to the US with his family. However, the travel route via Moscow proved fatal. The NKVD arrested him on the train in May 1941. He was sentenced to death for so-called counter-revolutionary Trotskyist activities and shot in 1942 at the age of 31. His wife died in prison. One of Held's fellow prisoners in Moscow was the Polish socialist Henryk Ehrlich, a leader of the Jewish Bund. He and another Bund leader were eventually killed by the NKVD in the 1940s. As the case of Walter Held and the Bund leaders show, the persecution did not end after 1938. During the period of the Hitler-Stalin Pact 1939 to 1941, the Stalin regime handed over at least 350 German and Austrian immigrants to the Gestapo. While expulsions to Germany had taken place in earlier years, this time there were more Jews and communists among them. Many were expelled straight from the Gulag. One example is Margarete Buber-Neumann, the wife of the murdered German Politburo member Heinz Neumann. In 1940, she was extradited from a labor camp in Kazakhstan to Germany, where she was immediately sent to the concentration camp Ravensbrück for another 5 years. An important account by a political émigré of the events and atmosphere in the Soviet Union are the memoirs by Wolfgang Leonhardt, who later broke with Stalinism. You can see him in this picture. His mother was arrested during the Great Terror, and he witnessed the purges as a young man. In one chapter in his memoirs, he remembers Trotsky's death in 1940 as a significant moment. On August 24, 1940, Soviet newspapers, as he describes it, briefly reported that Trotsky had died in Mexico after being attacked by someone from his own entourage. Pravda denounced Trotsky as an international spy and murderer. That evening, Leonhardt spoke with a former Schutzbund member working in a Soviet factory. This former Schutzbund member, an Austrian worker, said, "Can it really have been one of his entourage?" Voicing the same doubts Leonhardt had felt. As they walked, they saw posters going up for a festival in the Park of Culture. The man added, "Do you know what some workers in the factories are saying? They say that this festival has been announced now just because of Trotsky's death." Leonhardt stayed silent. Talking about Trotsky was still dangerous. Yet he found it striking that, even 13 years after Trotsky's expulsion, some workers still rejected the official story, and they believed Stalin capable of celebrating the killing of this revolutionary. Leonhardt studied in 1942 at the Comintern school near Ufa. He recalls that the students never had access to Trotsky's writings. The seminar on Trotskyism was limited to angry denunciations. In hindsight, Leonard understood this was deliberate. The Stalinist leadership saw no danger in students reading fascist or bourgeois text, but they feared that Marxist critiques of Stalinism, like Trotsky's, could seriously challenge their worldview and influence students. At the end of the Second World War, Leonard became part of the so-called Ulbricht group, a group of German Stalinists led by Walter Ulbricht, which was sent from Moscow to East Germany in 1945. There, this group dissolved spontaneously formed anti-fascist and factory committees. As Leonard commented, this dissolution of these committees was, quote, nothing other than a disruption of the first emergence of what might prove to be a powerful independent anti-fascist and socialist movement, unquote. After the war, the Stalinists continued their agenda of preventing revolution in Europe and suppressed the Trotskyist movement with brutal methods. In 1947, the young Austrian Trotskyist and resistance fighter Karl Fischer, who had just survived the concentration camp Buchenwald, was kidnapped by the NKVD and deported to the Gulag. He had been one of the authors of the Trotskyist Declaration of Internationalist Communists from the Buchenwald camp. In 1948, the German Trotskyist worker Oskar Hippe, which you can see on the other picture, was arrested by the NKVD in East Germany, and he was imprisoned for 7 years. In 1953, the German Czech Trotskyist and former secretary of Trotsky in Principo, Wolfgang Salus, was poisoned by a GPU agent in Munich. In France, Italy and Greece, where the communist parties led huge resistance movements against the Nazi invaders, it was their Stalinist leadership that played a key role in preventing a revolutionary upheaval at the end of the war. In Greece, they even assassinated Trotskyists. The counter-revolutionary policies of Stalin resulted in the defeat of the Greek Civil War in 1949. In the following years, the communist parties tried to cover up the murder of their own members during the Great Terror, and in Greece, the Stalinist KKI openly justifies the Moscow trials until today. Now, in conclusion, I want to return to the beginning of this lecture. It was the turn of the Stalinist bureaucracy against the program of world revolution that resulted in the extermination of a whole generation of the Comintern. This mass terror was aimed at suppressing and preventing any serious political opposition to Stalin's regime within and outside of the Soviet Union. These crimes had an enormous global impact. The communist parties and the left opposition around the world lost a large part of their cadre, which was especially devastating in countries under fascist and authoritarian rule. Most importantly, the terror dealt a severe blow to the consciousness of millions of left-wing workers who were appalled at and confused by the events. Given this bloody end of the Third International, the founding of a new international, the Fourth International in 1938, in the midst of the Great Terror, was a question of life and death for the international working class. Despite Stalin's effort to destroy and distort all that remained of the October Revolution, Trotsky built a Marxist party to carry forward the fight for socialism. The defeat and betrayal of the revolution in Spain the following year, which Comrade Alejandro will now address in the next lecture, proved how timely the founding of the Fourth International was. Thank you very much.